coming up on Garden Talk.
And their waste is then broken down and mineralized into a plant food that is then hyper bioavailable to the plants. So we can run much lower parts per million in terms of individual nutrient ranges and get the same kind of growth results because it's hyper available in the ranges that the plants need. The more fungi and mycorrhizal fungi you have increases lignin production in the plant, so the woodier parts of the plant. Also improves terpene expression and terpene variety as well. 4x4 with larger plants, I would say at least a 75 or 90 gallon aquarium. You could get by with as low as a 55 aquarium as long as it was super heavily stocked. The more we learn about the soil food web and the different food webs of our planet, the more we're improving our food safety and improving plant production at the same time.
What's up, everybody? If you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 64. In this episode, I interview Steve, also known as Potent Ponics. He is an expert in aquaponics, and that's what we're going to get into today. He's going to talk to us all about the basics of aquaponics. Thanks to all of you who support this podcast through Patreon. If you'd like to support, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MrGrowIt. Before we get into it, I want to acknowledge that one of my goals for this podcast is to bring zero cost for information about gardening, all plants, to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who help make that goal possible. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this podcast. They sent me over their grow tent, which has a canvas density of 2000D, making them the thickest grow tent on the market today. It has an aluminum plate that mounts your controller to the grow tent with a lightproof pass-through for cable routing. The frame has 50% thicker steel poles and carries 2 times more weight than the standard grow tents. Coupon code MrGrowIt will get you a discount on their products, and I'll leave a link to their website down in the description section below. And we are back. Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast. Today I am joined with Steve from Potent Ponics. How you doing today?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. We're going to learn all about aquaponics today. So you have an extensive knowledge when it comes to aquaponics. I myself don't have any experience with it. So I think this is going to be a pretty interesting talk here because I'm going to be able to pick your brain as somebody with very little knowledge of it. So hope you're prepared for this. I think this is going to help folks not only doing aquaponics, but there is a section that we're going to really get deep into pH. And so for those folks that aren't growing on aquaponics, maybe you're in soil or cocoa or even a hydroponic system, if this aquaponics talk doesn't really appeal to you much, you might just want to skip over to the pH section, at least listen to the pH section, because you'll definitely be able to have some takeaways on that avenue. But first, before we get too deep into things, let's do an introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into gardening?
Sure. So my name is Steven Reisner. I'm the owner of Potent Ponics, which is a aquaponics consulting company. We help with everything from lettuce to medicinal plants to trees to everything in between. And I've been working in the industry for a long time. So I originally got started farming and gardening with my grandparents who had a 2-acre farm. And we used to, they grew up pre-depression era. So we used to make our own pesticides from fermented tomato leaves and make our own cloning gel from willow shoots and all of our own, basically make all of our own stuff, which was super cool. And then later on moved into the more commercial side of things, getting into certain medicinal plants and then into vegetable and other production as well. And then later on worked out in Colorado in some of the medicinal plant industries. And then switched over to working in my own company, and I've now worked around the world in Africa and South America and across the Caribbean, across the United States, Canada, all over helping build different types of aquaponics facilities or helping people, especially with specialty crops. We did a lot of work with fruit trees and some other heavy feeding crops to try and dial that in, and that's been, I guess, a lot of my work. I guess is a short version of it. I originally started working in the pet trade, and then there's a lot of overlap with the pet trade and in certain types of plants that you grow that we all like to enjoy for recreational purposes. And then eventually from there got into aquaponics. We used to call them river tanks before there was the word aquaponics. and then started working out in Colorado, and then the floods happened out there, and then ended up getting a job at the aquaponics source in their research laboratory and all that stuff. So that was a really great a time managing that and doing all the different research work there in their lab. And then from there, they switched owners, and we had to. They weren't interested in having some of the different sectors of the company that I was heading up research-wise, and from there I started my own company, and I've been doing that for, gosh, I guess 7 years now, which is kind of hard to believe for me to say.
That's incredible. So lots of experience. So your overall style of gardening, I mean, you talked about aquaponics. Are you are only indoors, or do you also do outdoor growing? Have you done soil, cocoa, any like DWC? Are you organic or synthetic?
Sure. So I've grown pretty much every way you can think of. I've grown aeroponics, DWC, media bed, wicking bed, um, SIPs, whatever you want to call it these days. Um, Rafts beds, vertical beds. My personal favorite is dual root zones. So I'm a big fan of splitting up the pots and having the top half of the pot with a layer of soil separated with a layer of burlap or other root permeable media to keep the soil above it, and then below that a media, so like a clay leca or a hydrogen or a lava rock, and this allows you to flood and drain the bottom portion of the pot, the bottom 40% or so, 45% or so of the pot. And then at 50% of the pot, put a layer of burlap, and then the top half be soil. And this allows you to top feed the soil. You can amend that. You can make a super soil mix and have a nice living soil that has, companion plants and the mycorrhizae and other microbes that come along with that, and diversifying the microbial species in the upper portion of the root zone, and then all the aquatic fauna in the bottom portion of the root zone, which is also a huge factor in the health of a typical plant. The biggest way to improve the plant's biodiversity of its roots, or I'm sorry, the biggest way to improve the plant's immune system is to increase its biodiversity in the root system.
So lots of experience in several different areas when it comes to gardening. So that's pretty cool. So let's dive deeper into aquaponics. So, just starting for beginners, tell us what exactly is aquaponics?
Sure. So aquaponics is growing basically with organic hydroponics, I guess, is the simple form of it. But think of it, but more like aquatic soil, is how I prefer to describe it. So you have the fish, which are living in the system. So imagine a hydroponic system that has fish living in the reservoir, and their waste is then broken down and mineralized into a plant food that is then um, hyper bioavailable to the plants. So we can run much lower parts per million in terms of individual nutrient ranges and get the same kind of growth results because it's hyper available in the ranges that the plants need. And that makes a huge difference in how well that works for the plants. And then we have a huge microbial biodiversity in that. So basically the fish poops, we take that poop, we mineralize it the same way they would composting, I guess, in soil. Would be a good equivalent, and then converting it into liquid aquatic soil, which is the hypermineralized water that's recirculating all the time for the plants.
Okay. So basically, kind of taking a step back, you've got sort of like a fish tank, but are the roots, is it similar to like DWC where the roots are actually in the same tank as the fish? Or do you have a separate tank for it?
Sure. So in general, we usually keep the fish away from the plants. There's a lot of fish that will actually eat the roots of the plants. Koi in particular, love, and tilapia both will feed on the roots of the plants. So unless you have a particular reason for that, it is something that you want to avoid. So generally, we have a separate fish tank that flows into a central sump that is then going to both the grow bed and the fish tank, plumbing wise.
Okay. Let's get deeper into like the actual equipment that's required for this. You can do this on a home grow level as well as a commercial scale, right? So I think most of my audience is home growers. So I would like to narrow it down to just talking about home grow. However, if you feel like there is some information there that is applicable and it, overlaps with the commercial side of things when it comes to aquaponics, feel free to talk about that as well. But if you are a home grower and you're ready to start aquaponics, what equipment is required in order to get going?
Sure. So if you already have an aquarium at home, if you have an aquarium with a wet dry, All you really need to do is get a second overflow box from your for your aquarium, and then hang that onto the side of your flood and drain bed. And then you can have a flow through that way is a simple way to do it, or you can use a bell siphon as your return, or a loop siphon is another simple way that, in low cost way, to flood and drain a grow bed. And that doesn't fail. You don't need a timer or anything that's going to fail on you. Um, and those can be great, super low cost ways. Especially loop siphons cost, the cost of a piece of tubing that's 3 feet long. Like it's not expensive at all to do. And then run that back to a central wet dry sump that like you typically use for an aquarium, and then just pump from there to wherever. Or get a tough tote. Say if you don't have any of that, you can go to your local aquarium store. You can go get an overflow box for your aquarium. You can get a tough tote to use as your sump at Home Depot for like $15. And then you could go over and get a flood and drain kit from your local hydro store for like another, 25-30 bucks. Hook it all up to a central pump with a T, so that part of it goes to the fish tank, part of it goes to the grow bed. Make sure you have valves to adjust the flow rate so you can get it all set right and dialed in, and then away you go. It's not anything overly complicated. You can easily plumb them into an existing grow tent and an aquarium you have at your house already. It's nothing particularly complicated at all. I would suggest going with loop siphons or bell siphons over timer-based systems. Timer-based systems, if you're familiar with them, that's fine, but the timers always fail before the pumps fail, so it can kill your plants. It's not something you want to do.
Okay, so I'm imagining the fish tank, right? And I'm imagining another box, really, where or another container where the actual plant is located, right? And you said it's similar to a sense where, I mean, are you using like net pots and a hydroton or anything up top, and then the roots are kind of suspended into the lower section where the water is? Are there any like air stones down in that section, or is
Sure.
it all just kind of connected through and the flow oxygenate the water there?
So you can do a dual root zone, or I'm sorry, a DWC, and you can just put pots with a screen on the bottom of them, let the roots go through. That works really well. We've had quite a few people doing that, or even just a burlap on the bottom of a pot with some holes cut in the bottom to allow it to grow through. Works really well. The other way to do, if you have an existing DWC, otherwise just do a flood and drain in a regular flood and drain bed, or a drip bed. It's just fine. And you can use with or without media on the bottom part of the tray, as long as you have it in your pots. So generally we use 5-gallon pots or 3-gallon pots, depending on plant size, with the bottom half hydrogen, or lava rock with burlap, and in the middle, and then the top half soil.
Okay, so there are several different ways to kind of set up your equipment and be successful. Several different techniques
Yep.
on doing that.
The thing that helps the most is having that extra soil layer, even in the aquatic type setups, is because it increases the lignin production. The more fungi and mycorrhiza fungi you have, increases lignin production in the plant, so the woodier parts of the plant. Also improves terpene expression and terpene variety as well.
Interesting. Now I got to imagine that it would probably be best to have a fish tank first and like learn how to feed fish and have them survive before you take the next step and hook up your plants to that system. Is that right? Should you at least have basic knowledge on how to manage a fish tank? I know there's a lot of components to that in itself, right?
You're definitely better off having uh, at least a knowledge of how an aquarium cycles with the nitrogen cycling, and going from ammonia to nitrite to nitrate with the colonization of the various bacteria that help facilitate that. But your other minerals also work in that same way. So yeah, you want to have at least not have your first aquarium be your aquaponic system if you can help it. But if it is, then that's okay. I wouldn't say that's something that you're gonna fail at if you've never worked on an aquarium before, but you're certainly going to be better off having an aquarium and understanding how that works before getting into hybridized systems. I think it certainly can make the learning curve a little easier, but it's definitely nothing that you couldn't learn all at once, if you wanted to.
All right. And then how do you make this work in a grow tent? I know it's possible. Like I mentioned, a lot of my viewers are just home growers. So making this work in a grow tent, would the actual aquarium kind of be in the grow tent with it, or would you recommend it to be kind of outside the grow tent, then tubing coming into the grow tent with the plants, or how would that kind of all work within a grow tent?
Sure, yeah. So you would just sit your aquarium next to your grow tent and run the tubing into there. Maybe put the sump in the grow tent, or you could even put the sump outside of the grow tent if you want to. But make sure you have your grow beds in the grow tent, obviously, with the plumbing either running in there and having the sump and grow bed in there, or having the sump outside of it and having the plumbing go in and back out of the tent, depending on what's going to make more sense for your spot. But the easiest way would just be to throw the tough toad in there, set a short, table in there or something to keep, your grow bed height. Set your grow beds on there like two concrete mixing trays or standard 3x3 grow bed, and then put your plumbing off of there. So either your standpipe for your flood and drain, or for your uh, loop siphon or your bell siphon, depending on what type of setup you decide to go with.
And so say they're in a 4x4 tent and they want to run 4 plants in there. What size aquarium tank should they get for that? Does it need to be like, I know some systems out there, like auto watering systems, for example, are like gravity fed to where you have to have it above where the plants are. Are there any setups to where that has to be the case, or can really it be kind of on the ground and then you've got a pump kind of flowing everything through?
Sure. So yeah, as long as both the grow bed and the fish tank are above the sump tank, you can. It doesn't really matter with the grow bed to fish tank levels. You're not flowing directly from the fish tank to the grow bed in most setups. So you can plumb it that way and it will work, but I wouldn't recommend it. I think you're far better off having them from a central T that comes from the central feed spot, so that you have better, kind of basically two loops going around, one for the fish tank and one for the grow bed, works much more efficiently.
And then what size tank for the fish?
Sure. So I would go for 4x4 with larger plants. I would say at least a 75 or 90 gallon aquarium. You could get by with as low as a 55 aquarium as long as it was super heavily stocked. But you're really kind of pushing the lower limits of there's not enough fish weight to make enough biomass and fish poop to feed the plants at that point. You know what I mean? There's a kind of a minimum level of fish biomass that you need to have to feed the plants.
In the actual aquarium, 75 gallon, you've got the fish in there. What else is in that tank?
Sure. So we often will put the fish and then usually an algae eater or two just to keep the thing clean. And then we'll have the drain in the drain cover, whatever it is to keep them from getting sucked in. And then that's all we ever have in there. We'll have maybe some air stones or a heater sometimes, depending on the size of the fish tank.
I was going to ask, I know we're getting kind of deep into like managing an aquarium, but it does wrap into it. Is there like a certain water temperature that needs to be there for the fish? We'll get deeper into like different species of fish here in a few minutes, but like water temp, is there any lighting that needs to happen over that aquarium tank or what?
Sure. So as far as water temperature, generally 68 to 72 is where most of our facilities are running at for optimal fish growth and plant growth, and that seems to work really well across the board. If you're going for cooler weather crops, you could always go with a little bit cooler water, or in the summertime, if you're in an area where it's going to be really hard to cool that water, you could always go with like Mizuna or some of the other warm weather crops that aren't going to care so much. Yeah, okra would be another one that really doesn't care about heat.
Gotcha. And then the water that goes into the tank. We talked yesterday. I was actually on Steve's podcast yesterday, and we kind of talked a little bit about this fresh water versus salt water. I know it's a noob question, right? But we want to cover it here. So does fresh water go in there,
Sure.
or are there some aquaponic setups that have salt water in there?
Sure, so there's definitely ways that you can profit off of plants with salt water in aquaponics, but it doesn't work for um, uh, doing anything as far as terrestrial plants are concerned. Outside of brassicas, there aren't too many plants that'll grow in a brackish or saltwater type setting. Mangrove trees, if you're doing a mangrove tree rehabilitation program, maybe that would work. But outside of that, there isn't much usage for saltwater. Everything else is freshwater that we work with. There are people that do like abalone and urchins and kelp and stuff like that in aquaponic systems, but that's more aquaculture to me, I think.
And then species of fish. Are there certain fish that kind of work better than other fish? There's some fish that you should avoid.
Sure. So I would avoid anything particularly delicate. Don't do discus or angelfish or, you know, freshwater stingrays. They're or freshwater shrimps and stuff. They're just too sensitive. And as far as fish, you can use koi, tilapia, yellow perch, bluegill, any of the panfish are all good stuff for that. And then you can do larger tropical fish, Oscars and red-tailed catfish, things like that also work.
So for that 75-gallon tank example for the home grower who has his tank, how many fish should he put in that tank to begin? He or she, I should say.
Sure. So you could do like some larger freshwater South American cichlids. You could do a crap ton of guppies or mollies if you wanted to. You could do a couple of Oscars or some pacu or you know. I think that'd be a good route. Again, you want to make sure you're still housing the fish comfortably, but you're trying to get as much as you can in there. And it's not so much an issue with a lot of people be like, oh, well, that's too many fish for the aquarium. Well, you have to remember that we have this huge amount of nitrogen export. In an aquarium that's just sitting on the wall, there's nothing to export that nitrogen, right? But with our aquaponic systems, you have all these plants that are just sucking in all the nitrogen and all the waste from the fish. So you don't have that kind of chemical imbalance that people kind of associate with smaller aquariums. So you can push the limits quite a bit more than you're typically told you can with an aquarium.
Is there a way that you can kind of tell? Are there signals to know, like, okay, I have too many fish in this tank?
Sure. So I would just say if there's a high amount of aggression in the plant and the fish, and then if there's a large amount of issues with high nitrates or nitrites, that's going to be another one that's definitely going to cause issues. And then, again, just general cleanliness of the tank and the system. If it's really gunked up, obviously you have too much, but you're going to see that in your water chemistry. If you're not, again, your nitrates are too high, you definitely have a problem if your ammonia is too high. Ammonia too high would be anything above 0.25. Nitrates would be anything above about 40 or 50 parts per million, would be too high.
How do you measure that?
Sure. So you can get an aquarium test kit at any pet store. A lot of places will test your water for free. If you just bring them some water samples, tell us it's your aquarium, they'll happily test it for you for free. Yeah. And those test kits, API test kit you can get from Aquarium Pharmaceuticals, has been around for, since the 80s. It's a really reliable test kit, and as long as you don't get them too hot or too cold, they'll give you accurate readings. It's a titration test, so you have to put so many drops of one and so many drops of the other in the vial, but it's super simple. Anyone can do it. If you have color, now this is an interesting thing. If you do have color blindness issues, be sure to look into, as a company called Hanna and Lamotte. Both of those companies make digital monitors and digital meters that allow for digital outputs, so you don't have to read a color wheel or color comparison, because a lot of people do have color issues.
Okay. Before we get into pH, I want to dive deeper into that. I want to know about controlling the water temperature a little bit more. If the temperature is too cool, what do you do? If the temperature is too warm, what do you do?
Sure. So if the temperature is too cold, we usually fire up a heater. We usually use closed loop gas heaters or closed loop solar heaters. So we'll take solar water heaters and put them on a closed loop heat exchanger and heat the water that way. And then we'll supplement that when the weather is bad with a closed loop, basically tankless water heater on that same heat exchanger with a different, input loop on the glycol. And that's how we manage on larger systems. On smaller systems, you would just use a regular, aquarium heater or titanium heater, depending on the size of your system.
And then what about cooling?
And then as far as cooling, that's a harder problem. So usually when we have big facilities, we'll put coils in the ground. So we'll take big metal coils that you use for gas lines, the PEX, the yellow PEX line. We take the plastic off of that and bury it in big giant loops. And then we run glycol through that underground. Or ideally, if they have a farm pond or other pond, we'll sink it to the deepest part of the pond, and we can actually get significantly better heat exchange. It just depends on what we have available to work with. But generally, geothermal cooling is their first resort. And then if that doesn't work, you can go to chillers, but they're generally not financially viable. We usually try to keep the room cooler, so we'll have either AC or again, geothermal cooling with the tubing in the ground on bigger facilities to cool them down. And then again, on smaller stuff, you can always get a chiller if you wanted to. But generally, you try to prevent it in other ways, preventing open sun on the water and the grow beds as much as possible with plant canopy or shading cloth, or some of the other things that you can do to try and help prevent some of those issues. Cooling is a much harder problem.
There's definitely some good advice there, though, on how to control the water temperature. Now, pH. What is the ideal pH range for aquaponics?
Sure. So the ideal pH range for aquaponics generally is around 6.6. That's where you're going to get the most amount of mineral bioavailability for your system. Anything, above about 7, you're going to start to see a cutoff and reduction, and then anything below about 6.2, 6.0, you start to see another reduction. And then there is another peak lower on at like 5.7, 5.8, but it's not as good across the board for what we're doing. And then with all the microbial species and everything else, it's much better for us to maintain a 6.8 to 6.6 range for most of the systems that we're operating right now.
And then when you need to adjust the pH because it goes out of range, what are you typically using to adjust the pH?
Sure. So for aquaponics, we use potassium silicate, and we alternate that with powdered calcium carbonate, and that works really well for raising the pH. We can also use calcium chloride if we had to. If you're in hydroponics, you can. In a pinch, you can also use, a bunch of other things to raise pH, but generally we like potassium silicate and calcium carbonate is the main go-to. Every once in a while we'll use potassium bicarbonate when we need to also raise the alkalinity or the dissolved carbonate hardness to stabilize the pH a little bit more. We'll add that, but in general that's what we use for pH up. And then for pH down, we'll use phosphoric acid for smaller adjustments, and we also need to add some phosphorus to the system. And then for bigger adjustments, we just use muriatic acid, also called hydrochloric acid, which sounds a little crazy, but it's fine when you're diluting it out into thousands of gallons.
I should ask this before I asked how to adjust the pH and you touched on this a little bit, I believe, is what would cause the pH to go outside of that range? Is there something that the fish is doing that would cause it to go too high or too low?
Sure. So there's a couple of different things. So if your tap water or your base water, when you're adding and topping off the system, is high in pH, that can raise pH over time by building up your mineral levels in the system or building up the alkalinity in the system. So that can be one source. Another source would be if your system goes anaerobic, so say you're feeding the fish too much and there's lots of fish waste getting past your filtration and into the beds, and it's kind of clogging things up and starting to rot, that can also start to raise the alkalinity and raise the pH of the water. And that can be another sign of, why your water quality is going south. Or another thing, and this happens, I see this quite heavily in Colorado, I think is the place I've seen it most extreme, is that you can have issues when the water department switches reservoirs. So the springtime or the fall, or when frost hits or whatever, they'll switch from one lake to another or one reservoir to another, and you can have as much as a full pH point difference in 24 hours from your tap water, which can be a huge problem if you're trying to work with anything in aquaculture or even terrestrial plants.
Even when you're in soil or cocoa, having those large pH swings, I mean, that's destroying your microbe life, right? That's something that people don't talk about very often, is these large pH swings and how much damage it's actually doing to the microbial life. So I'm glad you mentioned that one. Going back to the pH up, and then we'll go to pH down afterwards. But pH up, you said you use a potassium silicate or calcium carbonate. I watched your video on pH with Chad Westport, and you said you had it under wrong to use potassium hydroxide, potassium carbonate, and calcium hydroxide. Why are those categorized as wrong to use as pH up?
Sure. So you can use potassium carbonate. I just think if you're going to use it, use the potassium bicarbonate because it's better for aquaponics specifically. The dissolved carbonate hardness, if it gets too low, will actually hinder microbial replication, and you'll get up to 50% slower breeding rates of your microbes that you're trying to harness to make your plants healthy. So it's kind of it's just a lesser option, I guess. But with the hydroxides are really easy to accidentally overdose and way overshoot. They also can't be put on airplanes, so I don't like to use things that are ORMD, which is what the military post office code was for it when I used to work for them, but a long time ago in a different life. But anything that goes on a plane or can't go on a plane, I'm not going to put in my system if I'm going to eat the vegetables or consume those plants in some form. It's just, to me, not a good starter. But it also only adds one useful element when everything else adds two. The carbonates add alkalinity, which helps your microbes and adds minerals. And then you have the potassium silicate, which the potassium is helping and the silica is helping. So why would you add a compound that's only adding one compound that helps the plants when you can add a compound that adds two? It just doesn't make any sense to me. You're kind of spending money to do the same thing for half as good of a product.
Understood. And would you say the same thing for somebody growing in soil or cocoa, or is that specifically for aquaponics? What you just said there.
Well, cocoa, personally, I hate cocoa. I think cocoa is finicky. Plants are just hard. It's just harder to maintain in cocoa. It's a lot easier to get pests and bugs and stuff. And I don't know. I always see like the worst farms I've visited consulting have almost always been cocoa. So I just don't, not a fan of cocoa. I'm a big fan of living soil and a big fan of aquaponics. Either method I think is kind of the top tier of the industry in terms of terpene levels and other important essential oil compounds in the plants that we're after, and the flavor compounds and other things that we're all after for high quality organic produce. I think that's really the best way to approach it. And both of them, again, why are they the highest levels of those compounds? Both of them are the highest level of microbial biodiversity in the root systems. It makes total sense why they're both, neck and neck in terms of production of those types of compounds. Just aquaponics does it all twice as fast growth speed wise. So you get quite a bit more produce per year than normal.
So pH down, referring to the one with Chad Westport, the video I just talked about, you have phosphoric acid, muriatic acid, which you just mentioned as a pH down, what you would use for it. You also have lactic acid bacteria, serum, organic listed under right. Now under wrong, this is going to cause a little bit of controversy here because I know a lot of people use vinegar, citric acid. Those are two main ones that people use all the time for pH down. And then you also have nitric acid. So why are those under wrong?
Sure. So nitric acid is the easiest one, I guess, to get out of the way first. In aquaponics, the fish provide all the nitrogen. I don't need to add more nitrogen, right? We have all the nitrogen we need. It's already accounted for. We're budgeting it in the fish output into the nutrient solution and how much they're producing per day. So that's accounted for, right? So I don't want to add nitrogen. So that's that one. Vinegar, first off, is a horribly poor, weak acid. It also creates all kinds of secondary chemistry issues with polarity and just smells like, I love eating vinegar and vinegar chips, but a room with plants in it that has vinegar in it just smells horrible to me. So I think that it's just, for your money spent, you could buy a much cheaper acid that's much more effective, that you could dose a tenth as much to do the same amount. It's not cost effective economically. Citric acid. So citric acid is very weak as well, and the same reason. You also have a buildup of some of the compounds in it. If you're in a closed loop aquaponic system where we don't dump our reservoirs except maybe once every, maybe a couple percentage points per month, we're taking maybe 3%, 2% per month just as a trickle off, mainly to make sure we never get heavy metal issues over time from a water source, unless we have a good filtration system. Then we don't need to do that. But we just don't want to take the risk with that. But the biggest thing comes down to is just cost. If you're organic certified, then yeah, okay, you're pigeonholed into doing that, and I understand that, and that's fine. But most crops as well, if you're already doing aquaponics, you can demand a very similar price point to organic certified without having to deal with all the rigmarole of organic certification, because it's quite expensive. A lot of people don't realize how expensive it is, not to mention the labor cost. It takes a lot of labor time to do all the data entry to maintain your organic certification, and you can be inspected at any time, which a lot of people listening to the show are not be appreciating someone randomly showing up to inspect their facility for one reason or another. So All of those things are entailed, along with, whatever portion of the farm that you dedicate as organic certified production. That's the only thing that you can do there. You can't utilize that space for anything else. So, and the rules are overly restrictive, and it just very few crops demand, unless you're at a really large scale, it's not generally worth it to go with organic. So I know that sounds horrible for an organic regenerative person to say, but you're far better off just growing organically, having regenerative practices, getting some of the other cheaper certifications, and getting the same price point as the organic guys. You're going to get, pretty much the same price anyway. Why pull your hair out and deal with the government when you can not do any of that and get paid the same? I just don't see a point.
So for the pH down, lactic acid, bacteria serum, phosphoric acid, muriatic acid, thumbs up. Not advised to use would be the vinegar, citric acid, and nitric acid. For aquaponics, would you say the same thing for soil and soilless mediums?
Yeah, if you're mixing a nutrient solution, all this stuff, I would say pretty much would go the same way. I mean, yeah, if you're in a pinch and you're out of everything else, yeah, you could use those, like whatever, or if you're in soil and you need to add nitrogen, or cocoa and you need to add nitrogen, because you're low on nitrogen, then yeah, use nitric acid, right? Because chemically you're balancing it out for that, right? So it's just a matter of using it appropriately and thinking about how you're balancing out that total nutrient solution that you're trying to build up there. That's really what it comes down to. And I'm a big fan of, again, the you mentioned too, the lactobacillic acid. Lactobacillic acid will lower pH by zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 points pH in a 1 to 1,000 dosage. So 1 gallon per 1,000 gallons lowers it that much. It's decently strong acid compared to most of the others.
A lot of people are really concerned about using pH up and pH down because they are growing in living soil, for example. I know we're kind of getting off topic on the aquaponics thing, but I think this is kind of important for some people to hear.
Okay.
Is they're afraid that they're using these and they're killing off their microbes in the medium. Using pH up and down, are those killing off microbes or no?
So all pH up and all pH down will kill microbes if you use too much of it. So the trick is to try and adjust zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.2 pH in a 24-hour period. So if you do it low and slow and you do it over the course of a week or two, microbes don't care, the plants aren't going to care, your fish aren't going to care, everything's going to be fine. But if you swing it quickly, you're screwed. So what we normally do with pH up or pH down, I'll mix it up into like a 5 gallon or 10 gallon bucket, and we'll sit it on the edge of the sump with we drill out a hole in the bottom, and then we'll put a airline, we'll super glue an airline nipple that you can get for like 75 cents or 90 cents at the pet store, that has a little valve on it. And then all you have to do once you have that glued into the bottom bucket is open it up so it's dripping, or a small slow stream. So that pH up is dosing over the course of 4 to 6 hours, and slowly dosing the water and mixing in, so you're not dumping a bunch of it in and nuking everything right there. It's kind of a slow adjustment, and that's really the trick to it is, and if you don't have that kind of setup, you can always build something that, punch a little hole and have it, you can time how long it takes to drain a container, right? Like, this is really basic, simple stuff. You can scale it to any size system that you're doing, and it can be a really simple way to kind of time release it without having to have it, I don't have to go dose it. Even if you did say, I need to dose this many gallons of pH down, you can mix that up and then just, every 30 minutes just throw a cup in there or whatever, if you want to do it by hand. But that's the trick, is just doing it slowly.
Last question on pH would be, some people swear by the vinegar and the citric acid. They're going to say that's way better to use than phosphoric acid or muriatic acid. And they say that microbes are safe. Just want to reiterate that you're saying that if you're using enough of it, vinegar and citric acid could certainly negatively impact the microbes.
Oh yeah, vinegar is used all the time as a cleaner. Like, my grandma used to use it as a cleaner. Like, she'd mix that and some lemon juice and throw it, make the whole kitchen smell like lemon vinegar. But it'll kill microbes. Again, it's the concentrations. Any of these, if you're using them in a strong concentration, of course they're going to kill stuff. But there's no difference between, vinegar, pH down from vinegar or citric acid in terms of its ability to kill microbes. It's killing microbes because of the rapid shift in pH, not because of the chemical compound. The chemical compound of any of these is not toxic. You can, muriatic acid is used in candy. It's used. Phosphoric acid is in soda, right? Like these aren't scary compounds, right? Like they're. I think oftentimes people think they hear acid or they hear like, whatever mineral because it's in a mineral name, and it's like, well, yeah, but you use it in your food all the time. Like it's calcium carbonate's a bread leveler, right? Like it's nothing scary.
Thanks for the clarification there, because pH is certainly one of those hot topics where I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on it.
Well, I think the biggest misunderstanding in pH is pH. People use the word pH and alkalinity interchangeably, which is completely wrong. Like, I don't know how that got started, but alkalinity is your DKH, your dissolved carbonate hardness, which is measured in two ways, either DKH, which is dissolved carbonate hardness units, or in parts per million. So you can measure it either way. Usually you want 2 to 5 DKH, which is 36.7 or 36.8. I don't remember exactly, parts per million to like 80 parts per million plus minus. So that's your target range, to make sure that you're not overshooting your pH. Because if you go above those levels I just mentioned, you're going to way overshoot your pH just by default. Your alkalinity is your stability of your pH. So your higher your alkalinity, the less likely you are to have a pH shift or pH change. Whereas the lower the alkalinity, you can have a really low alkalinity, and if you check your pH every day when you come home from work at 5 p.m., it'll be the same. But if you check it at 5 a.m., it could shift by 2/3 of a point, as the photosynthetic bacteria wake up or go to sleep, and the chemistry starts to change overnight. So, it just depends on, what water chemistry you have, but you can have pretty severe ones. So if you are seeing a bouncing of your pH over a 24-hour period, even without an alkalinity test, you can immediately tell your alkalinity is too low.
Sounds like that's a common mistake, especially for beginners that they make there, is confusing the two or using them interchangeably, like you mentioned. What are some other common mistakes that people make when trying to grow with aquaponics?
Sure, overfeeding. I think that's another one. Or having like nowhere near enough fish, or way too many fish. Those are another ones. Or people having like tons of gravel in an aquarium where they're trying to also get the poop to flow out to get to the plants. It's you got to have a bare bottom aquarium or close to it to have any kind of aquaponic system. It works better. Not to say you can't, but it'll work a lot better if you do. Trying to think what else. People using all kinds of weird cockamamie stuff for pest control, like people spraying their plants with Windex or OxyClean or like you name it. If it remotely sounds like it might be organic or natural, I've had people spray it on it and then call me and tell me they did it. Like just because it has a lemon scent doesn't mean that you should spray it on plants. Like I don't understand. Like there's just people get all these weird ideas on stuff. I've had some stories that I can't mention on here without ruining your ability to monetize this episode. Um, and yeah, some pretty ridiculous stuff that I've been asked over the years. But I think most of them weirder ones. I think by far the one, and I had like 3 calls all within like a year of the same question is like, what is the acceptable level of radon and uranium in the water that I can use for bore water in Australia? And it was like the same little area that all had like the same idea to get into aquaponics at the same time in the middle of nowhere, Australia. And they had high levels of uranium and radon in the water, and I was like, do not use that water for anything living. Like, no, no, the answer is zero. Zero is the acceptable level. Like,
Oh man, that's crazy. That is crazy. So, what advice do you have for folks that are just starting with aquaponics?
sure. So I would just say, read up a bunch on different YouTube channels and things like that. Make sure you understand how an aquarium works from a chemistry standpoint. Planted aquariums, especially, can be a really good way to kind of better understand the chemistry in terms of chemical interactions of an aquaponic system, because aquaponics doesn't have a lot of good, because it was approached so heavily from the hydroponic people, and like universities that had hydroponic or agriculture programs. They didn't really, in my opinion, approach it originally from the right way. They didn't approach it from the standpoint of uh, again, living aquatic soil. That the microbe diversity was as important as the mineral levels, and trying to max. That's why I think that you have such a wonderful marriage with KNF in aquaponics because it hybridizes so freaking well and allows us to unlock, in some cases, 80% more minerals from our fish waste when we start to add things like liquid IMO and labs to the system. We've also noticed that labs completely eliminates waterborne E. coli, as well as salmonella and a couple of other pathogens that we've done some testing on. So I think that you're going to see, in 5 or 10 years from now, lactobacillus dosing required for food safety protocols for any kind of food production in aquaponics, or even hydroponics potentially, because why would you not add something that accelerates your plant growth rate and eliminates pathogens? It's kind of a win-win, and it's low cost. I mean, you can do a facility of 10,000 square feet for like $8 a week or whatever. It's not breaking the bank in any way. Like it's cheap stuff.
That's really interesting. So yeah, it seems like it's a sustainable approach that's going to become more and more popular.
It was certainly surprising when we were running the trials with the labs. We had just by happenstance, happened to have a non-human pathogenic E. coli strain in there. It's a soil E. coli. There's thousands of different ones that do different soil functions and stuff like that, but it happened to end up in the system. We ended up doing a treatment of it and realized, hey, it eliminated the E. coli. Isn't that a weird side effect? So then we had another farm, a lettuce farm, that was a commercial farm that had tested hot for E. coli in their water. We tried it and within 30 days eliminated it from there. And we've done 2 more farms since then that we managed to have similar type water pathogen issues where the water department came in and weren't happy with them with their water results. And within 30 days, we've been able to mitigate it using, Korean natural farming practices, lactobacillus in particular, to eliminate those things. So again, the more we learn about the soil food web and the different food webs of our planet, the more we're improving our food safety and improving plant production at the same time.
That's incredible. Yeah, definitely a big success story there. Cool. Well, I appreciate you letting me ask you some beginner questions there. I'm sure we could have gone over a lot more. I really wanted this to be just the basics of aquaponics, more like an introduction to it. You're the first person on this podcast that has ever talked about aquaponics. So I think an introduction to begin. Maybe in the future we can do a part 2 with something more, a little bit more advanced knowledge for the folks that do have experience, and maybe they can get a little bit more out of it. But I definitely think looking back, the pH in particular is not only going to help people who are in aquaponics, but it will also help the folks growing in soil and soilless mediums as well. So appreciate you sharing that with us today. Before we wrap things up, tell us, how can the listeners find you and what do you have upcoming in the future?
Sure. So I have my own podcast as well called the Growing with Fishes podcast. We're on our 6th year this year. We are at almost 300 episodes. We're coming up on. You can check that out. We've interviewed a ridiculous slew of people. We had Frenchie on twice, who since passed away recently. We had a ton of other activists that are no longer with us, and then a whole bunch of experts from around the world. Everyone from soil scientists to genetics experts to we did a whole 14 hours on plant protections and things like that after the phyllo scandal, and we really try to cover every aspect of this industry, and there is maybe a slight leaning towards the commercial side of it just because that is what I do and most of the panelists do just for a living, but we do cover a lot of home grow stuff, and it is all geared towards living soil and aquaponics. If you're interested in aquaponics, the first 16 episodes are kind of more of a how-to beginner's guide to get started. After that, we really kind of assume that, hey, we gave you the base knowledge, now we're going to start to get more complicated and build upon what we've been teaching you. And then we also have Marty and I, the co-hosts of the podcast, have a whole online school, apmjclass.com. You can check that out. We have nutrients if you need nutrients for your stuff at apmjnewts.com. And then you can find a podcast on your favorite podcast app, SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, all the things. And then as far as stuff coming up, we have the Supernatural Conference coming up in July 29th, 30th, and 31st in Oklahoma City. I will be speaking there on IPMO, which is Advanced IMO Collection specifically for targeting pests and infecting pests with natural predators. So I'm going to be teaching a little seminar on that. As well as some other cool advanced Korean natural farming methodologies, along with Chris Trump, Patrick King, Wendy Kornberg, Susan Wainwright Evans, and a whole bunch of other awesome organic experts. And then I have Danielle from Aquilitas coming on the show on the 28th. She's one of the leading researchers if you're into learning more about how to hybridize aquaculture waste and inputs with soil production. They utilize that and have done lots of testing. They've shown that it can increase THC, CBD, and other types of important compound expressions, essential oil compound production by as much as 17%, and some of the terpene expressions by as much as 40%. And total crop yield by as much as 53%. And this is by utilizing heavy living soil, happy, good living soil, and then watering it with just base filtered water versus aquaculture water. So that really does make a huge, huge difference in the chemistry. And then on the 12th of May, we have Tommy Chong coming on the show. So looking forward to that as well. So.
Yeah, we had Tommy Chung on the From the Stash podcast with me, Rob from CLTV and Pigeons 420, and he's got some stories there. He's a talker, so I think he's going to. I think he'll definitely do well on your podcast. And I was on your podcast not too long ago, so I'll definitely have a link to the episode I did on his channel in his podcast down in the description section below. If you're on YouTube, if not. If you're on one of the podcast platforms, just search for it on YouTube and it'll come up. Just search Potent Ponics and Mr. Grow It. It should pop up first. I'll definitely have a link to your channel, your YouTube channel as well, down in the YouTube description section below. And yeah, head on over there, give him a follow. And that's just about it. If you enjoyed this episode, click that thumbs up button. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Every single week, I'm releasing a new Garden Talk podcast episode, and I would love for you to tune into future episodes. Steve, once again, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. This was very insightful for not only me, but I think a majority of my audience as well. So thanks for coming down here and dropping those knowledge bombs.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show. It's been great.
All right. Until next time, take care, everyone. Peace.